Hi, I'm Mr. Rosengrant, and I have with us today Dr. William Deresiewicz, former Yale professor and author of the book Excellent Sheep, The Miseducation of American Elite, and the Way to a Meaningful Life. Dr. Deresiewicz, thank you for joining us today.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me on.
Yeah. And I'm a high school counselor, and I work with students and parents and help them, plan for their future. And a lot of students are thinking about college and what they're going to do after high school. And after reading your book, I thought it did a great job kind of pointing out some common misconceptions that a lot of us might have about colleges. And one of those misconceptions that I know I had myself, and I think a lot of students and parents have, is that there's this idea that there's these kind of universal good schools, and then there's some schools that are bad schools and schools in between. And a lot of high school students will come to me and they'll say, I want to apply to a good school. Which schools are good schools? So, what are your thoughts about that? What are your thoughts about these elite schools? And are there universal good schools, or is it more about students learning more about themselves and who they are and what their needs are and finding their college match?
Yeah, I think the idea that there are schools that are universally good for everybody is a silly idea. It's understandable why people think that there are. There's this sort of huge economy of prestige that's been created in American higher education, actually for many, many years, but certainly in the last 30 or 40 years. So people look at the US news rankings and they just start at the top and go down the list, and they think that that's a list of, excuse me, really sorry about that. They
No
think
problem.
that that's a list of the best schools in order. Um, I will say that I do think that there are some schools that are not good for anybody. We don't need to name them. I've been to some of them. Uh, they're not necessarily schools that are lower in the rankings. Some of them are quite high in the rankings. And we can talk about why that might be. But fundamentally, yeah, the thing that you and other college counselors at high schools tell students, that it's about finding the school that's right for you, is fundamentally the correct idea. I mean, one of the strengths of our system in the United States is that we have many different kinds of schools. We have big research universities. We have small liberal arts colleges. We have religious schools, women's colleges, military academies, historically Black colleges and universities. We have schools in cities, schools in rural communities. We have some schools that have fairly unusual educational models, like the St. John's Great Books Colleges, or an experimental school like Minerva in San Francisco. So it really is set up to, I should say, we have community colleges that are definitely the right way to start for a lot of students, and they may be the right way to end for a lot of students. There are trade schools. College is not necessarily the right option for everybody. So we have this wonderful diversity of institutions, which is a good match for the diversity of students that we have. Um, I used to say that it's about finding, even in that book, which came out almost 7 years ago, I used to say that it was about finding the right school for you. I don't say that anymore either. It's not like there's one perfect school for you. You know, when you take away the pressure of having to get into Harvard or Stanford or whatever, and then you replace it with the pressure of having to find the perfect school for you, you're not necessarily helping kids that much. I think for any student, there are a whole bunch of schools, and not necessarily all of the same type, that would be a really good fit. Not the best fit. There's probably no best fit. There are lots of good fits.
So students could, if they spend some time kind of figuring out what they want and what they need, they could find a list of multiple schools that, if they were accepted to any one on the list, would probably have a great experience and get a good education and be very successful.
Yeah, I mean, I always forget what the number is, but there, I think about 2,000 legitimate four-year colleges in this country. And then that doesn't count community colleges, doesn't count for-profit colleges, which nobody should ever go to. 2,000, that's a lot of schools. There are plenty, I mean, if anything, I think that the difficulty in the college choice is not finding a good school, but narrowing down what's really a ridiculously large range of options. But yeah, I mean, there are all kinds of ways to narrow that range down. Some of them are not very smart. Some of them are.
Well, and that's something we can get into here. So one
Yeah.
of the things that students look at is college selectivity. So they look at how selective a school is and they get certain impressions from that. So what is college selectivity and what does it really mean? What does it really tell you? How does it inform the student anything about the college?
Well, selectivity is this number that U.S. News and other ranking entities come up with that's based on admissions rate. It's based on the percentage of students in the top 10% of their high school class. Um, those, and maybe yield also, which is the percentage of students accepted who actually go to the school. Um, it tells you how hard a school is to get into, which is sort of a way of saying it tells you how many people want to get into that school. But there's this concept, not in education, but people talk about triangular desire, which is that you want something because other people want it. This is not a good reason to want something. Um, selectivity, I mean, I think it's felt to be a proxy for how quote unquote good a school is. But it isn't necessarily that at all. I mean, first of all, we have to ask ourselves, what does it mean to say that a school is good? I would even say that there isn't one answer to that question. Good for whom? That's the real answer. But mainly, it's important to know that selectivity correlates very well with the wealth of the student body. I mean, so many of these metrics are things that rich families, upper middle class and upper class families are capable of buying for their kids. I mean, there's interesting, if you look at the correlation between SAT scores and grades, about 60% of students get SAT scores that are roughly correlated with their grades. 20% get scores that are worse and 20% scores that get better. The 20% that get scores that are worse tend to be poor kids because their parents don't have the resources to put into test prep and things like that. And the 20% who get scores that are better than their grades would indicate are rich kids. So we can't take these kinds of metrics seriously.
Yeah, so a lot of people have the idea that, if a school's hard to get into, then that must translate to some type of value, or it says something about that school must be a really good school. And I talk to a lot of college reps at different colleges, and they'll tell you, one year to the next, they might just get a lot more applications one year for whatever reason, whether it's marketing or whether it's something in the economy or whatever. The school hasn't changed for the most part one year to the next. But their selectivity has changed quite a bit. So they became way more selective the year that they had way more applicants and had to reject more because they can only take the same amount of people. So,
And it's important to know that a lot of schools, forgive me for interrupting you, but I want to
sure.
make sure we hear this point. A lot of schools for a lot of years, because selectivity is so important, because it's a major component of the US News ranking, which is really important, and not just for bragging rights, not just for prestige. A school's credit rating depends on its rank in US News. So what do schools do? What they call juke the stats, right? They artificially try to increase their rank. And one of the big ways that schools do that is what they call an attract to reject strategy. They increase the number of their applicants basically by flooding kids' inboxes with emails or their mailboxes with brochures. I mean, Tulane, for example, was notorious for doing this. And thereby they take the same number of students, so their selectivity goes up, their admissions rate goes down. Nothing has changed about the school except that they've duped more students into applying.
Yeah, and that's a real shame because my job as a school counselor is to try to do what's in the best interest of the students. So when colleges are recruiting students that they know don't have a very good chance of getting accepted, they're doing it to increase their numbers. That's really a shame for our students because they're spending money on these college application fees and time, and so that's why again, going back to really trying to find that college match and trying to find that list of schools that are really a good match for you that you're likely to be accepted to is so important. And you mentioned too about college rankings. So I thought we could talk a little bit about that. What are the college rankings, like US News and World Report? And what are some of the things that they use to come up with those rankings? I know selectivity is one of the things on that list. And is there any, can those rankings be used in some positive way? Is there some value to the rankings? I know people use them to
Yeah.
try to guide them to what colleges they might want to apply to, which I don't think is the best use for the rankings. But is there some
I,
positive use
the
at all?
rankings are just completely ridiculous. I mean, the problem with the rankings is that they assign every college a number, and people are habituated to believe that if something has a number attached to it, that the number measures something real. You know, we're told that a building is 123 feet tall. So, okay, we know that that's an actual thing. But to say that something is a college is 123rd or 23rd or third in the ranking, that's not a real thing. I mean, first of all, the distinction between colleges of slightly different rank is meaningless. To say that one is 10 and one is 20, that's a meaningless distinction. Second of all, as I suggested before, the rankings lump together schools of very different types. So if you look at the top 10 or top 20 liberal arts colleges, you have women's colleges, military academies, a couple of engineering schools. These are completely different kinds of schools. But the most important thing is that those rankings are a composite of a whole bunch of different metrics that US News has worked out. And the individual components themselves are often very specious as any kind of proxy for quality. The most obvious one, and it's a big factor in the score, is what they call reputational rank. They basically send a survey out to college leaders across the country asking them to rank other colleges. But what is the basis of a school's reputation? It's mainly their pre-existing rank in the rankings. So a reputational score simply reinforces the ranking. There was a great article about these rankings by Malcolm Gladwell in the New Yorker quite a few, probably 10 years ago. And he told the story that there was one study done of these rankings where they sent this survey out to law school deans, because, you know, law schools, of course, every kind of school has rankings too. And they included Penn State in the rankings. And Penn State, which is kind of a middle of the pack university, its law school ended up with a kind of middle of the pack reputational score. The problem is that Penn State did not have a law school at the time. And yet its law school received a reputational score. This is what these things are worth. And as I said, a lot of other components like selectivity can be artificially inflated. Sometimes schools just lie about their numbers because they're self-reported. Some of them are really just a proxy for institutional wealth, like faculty resources rank, which really has to do with how much money professors make. You know, maybe you could say, well, a richer school is likely to be a better school. You know, up to a point. I mean, a school that's deep, that's really under-resourced, like a lot of public universities are, that probably damages the educational experience. There's no question about it. But schools with a lot of money, you have to ask, what are they spending the money on? And they're not necessarily spending it on anything of value for an undergraduate educational experience.
Yeah, and I think a lot of times students, they're not so much maybe concerned with the actual rankings. I think what they're really concerned with is their own personal success. So the rankings give them the impression that these are better schools. If they go to the better schools, they're more likely to be successful. But there's also some research that shows that maybe that's not true either, that it maybe has more to do with the actual student themselves and their own ambition, their own motivation, rather than the school. Can you speak on
Yeah.
that a little bit?
Oh, yes, yes. I mean, I think, first of all, I want to say that it's about success. I think it's also about prestige. I think it's also about status. And I think we shouldn't downplay that. I think that also plays a big role for a lot of parents. And as far as I understand, students tend to go to the most highly ranked school that lets them in. So ranking plays a huge role in student choice. And there's this idea, as you suggested, that the higher ranked the school, the more likely you are to be successful in life. There was a very important study that every parent and every graduating student should know about, and I mentioned it in my book, that came out with the results that were really counterintuitive, so much so that uh, the scholars who did it actually redid the study with a much larger sample to test their initial findings. The findings were that, in fact, there is no correlation. Now, because what they did is they didn't look at, well, what's the average salary of a Penn graduate versus what's the average salary of a Penn State graduate? Because that doesn't tell you, that doesn't control for the kinds of students that the schools admit. So what they did is they matched students who went to schools like Penn, and they chose a lot of schools, with students who went to schools like, who got into schools like Penn, but went to schools like Penn State instead, for whatever reason, often for financial reasons. And what they found was that going to the lower ranked school had no effect on future earnings. Their future earnings were the same. Places like Penn and Princeton and Harvard have higher average incomes because of the students they admit, not because of what happens to you at those schools, or even the kinds of connections that those schools enable you to make, which they do. They certainly do enable you to make connections. But if what you're principally concerned about, as I think most kids and families are, is your future earnings, it doesn't matter. And I would also say that for a smart, hardworking, ambitious kid, there are a lot of good reasons to go to a school where they're going to stand out more. Maybe that's a Penn State, as opposed to being thrown into the Shark Tank with all the other students who are exactly like them, where it's going to be hard to distinguish themselves.
Yeah, that kind of brings me to my next question that, you talk about some of these more elite, highly selective schools like Ivy League schools, and students are, fighting to get into these schools. But like you mentioned, sometimes maybe it's better for you and maybe you have a better experience if you're more of the big fish in a small pond as opposed to the small fish in a big pond. And your book, you also kind of point out some maybe problems with some of these highly elite schools that, even though a lot of us or a lot of people kind of think of these highly elite schools as the best schools, there could actually be some negative aspects to some of these highly elite schools. Do you want to talk a little bit about that?
Sure. Well, to me, the main thing has to do with the culture at these schools. So again, because of the way the college admissions process has evolved over the last few decades, I mean, I graduated from high school almost 40 years ago. It wasn't like this then, but it's gotten worse and worse and worse. I think everybody understands this. And this is what the book is principally about, Excellent Sheep. It's about the kinds of kids that this process produces. By the time you get to college, what kind of person do you have to be in order to get into one of those schools? And you have to be what David Brooks, the Times columnist, called, before me, wrote about this, called achievement machines. You have to be an achievement machine. I think everybody understands this. No sleep, constant hoop jumping, learning to please the adults, no time for downtime, no time to really think, no time to develop as a human being, no time to be creative, no time to really pursue your passions, as opposed to, what is it now, 12, 15 APs that some of these kids do, and 12 or 15 extracurriculars that they supposedly do, or at least put on their resumes. So then you get to these schools, and yeah, these schools have a lot of money, a lot of resources. They have brilliant professors who may not necessarily have any interest in teaching undergraduates. We can talk about that separately. But for all the resources they have, what kind of culture do they have? They have a culture that consists of these kinds of kids. And contrary to what some students believe, because they tell me this, when you get to college, it's not like you've made it. I mean, you may think that once you've gotten the acceptance. So say from January or April of your senior year until September when you get to school, and maybe there are a couple of weeks of honeymoon, but then you realize that it's exactly the same environment that you just left, except it's worse. Because now it's all the people who've been successful in that environment, and they're all competing for the next thing, which means admissions to a prestige medical or law school, or a job at an investment bank or a consultancy, or with a big Silicon Valley company. So again, real learning, exploration, curiosity, just being a human being becomes impossible. This is the problem. It's not how smart the kids are. It's not how smart the professors are. It's the environment. It's very hard to get a real education in that environment. I saw this firsthand, and I saw that the few students of mine at Yale who really wanted to felt out of place. They felt like freaks. They felt like their peers looked down on them because they weren't chasing the brass ring, and the university was no longer set up to serve them well. Partly for the other reason that I brushed past, but I want to mention again. Most of these elite schools are research universities, which means that the professors are heavily disincentivized from spending 1 second more with their students than they have to. They are often remote figures at the head of a lecture hall with whom you will have little or no actual one-on-one contact ever. And the real teaching is handled by graduate students or by no one. Again, this is not a situation where you're going to get a real education. So.
And I think that, is a great segue into, one of my favorite parts about your book, An Excellent Sheep, which is, what is an education for? Do we even need to go to college? Why are we going to college? What is the purpose of getting an education? And you also, you mentioned about that, how those elite colleges have kind of strayed in that direction, which makes it harder to kind of focus on what an education is really for. And right now with the economy, and there's also people that just sort of are asking, is it worth it to pay for college? Or, is college just all about what you mentioned in your book is just a return on investment? Is it just about getting trained to do one job? And then is that the whole purpose of a college education? So can you talk to us a little bit about what is college for? What is an education for?
Sure. I mean, first of all, let me say that I think it's reasonable and not just with the pandemic. I mean, this has been true for a long time. It's reasonable for students and families to think about how much this is costing me and what am I getting out of it. And I would say that one important guideline for choosing a college should be how much it costs and how much debt you're going to come out with, because I'm not sure it's worth it. It's to load up on debt because it's really going to limit your options in the future. But I'm still a big believer in college. I think it's very hard to get a real education outside of college. There are people who do it, but it's hard. College, if it's done right, and you have professors who are engaged and peers who are engaged, teaches you to think and forces you to think in a way that's almost impossible to find outside of school. So to me, that's the central purpose of college, is to teach you to, I know it's a cliche, teach you to think, but really, it's a real problem now. People just look around us in the culture and society. People are, especially in the internet age when we're in our information silos, learning how to think critically is crucial. Learning how to think about yourself is crucial. That's another thing that college should be for. This kind of informed introspection that college gives you an interval to develop, because that's especially important at the entry to young adulthood, where you can, with the assistance of great books and great professors, learn to think, stop and think about what you really want and what you really believe and what you really care about. Those are the crucial things. Before you go off into the world and the world starts flying at you, get some kind of grip on yourself. And what is it that matters to you? I like to say that the two things that people should think about when they think about their career is not what do I want, or what is this going to get me, but what do I care about and what do I like? What do I like to do? And you need to stop and think about that before you plunge in. The last thing I would say is that doing these things, and again, maybe they sound like great ideas, but can I afford to do this at $40,000 a year or whatever, is that these are actually very practical things. So learning how to think is really important in the job market. I mean, one of the myths is that humanities majors, liberal arts majors, are doomed to poverty. This is simply not true, and study after study after study has shown this. Yes, there's a gap in initial wages compared to technical majors. Engineers make more straight out of college. That gap more or less disappears within 10 years. Because what an engineer learns in college, and this is also a danger of training yourself too narrowly in college. If you study their technical fields, and again, I quote people who say this in the book, people with legitimate authority who really understand this. If you study something too narrowly technical, but have also not learned to think, which means to retrain yourself, to teach yourself as you go forward, you will find that your knowledge is obsolete within 5 or 10 years. And in fact, most people who get engineering and STEM degrees, within a certain number of years, they're no longer in those fields, certainly at the technical level. They may be managers because their knowledge becomes obsolete. In some cases, the whole field becomes obsolete. I wouldn't study petroleum engineering right now, for example. I mean, it's unlikely that 20 years from now, people are going to want a petroleum engineer. So training yourself for the first job after college is really a recipe for professional stagnation. But if you learn to think the way the liberal arts teaches you, and the liberal arts also includes basic science fields as well, anything where you're really thinking rigorously and not just learning a body of knowledge or skill, what we call soft skills, problem solving, communications, creative skills, these are really valuable in the job market, and they become more and more valuable the farther you go along and you get more and more responsibility. And that's why the wage gap closes. So the same things that are good for you as a human being are actually good for you professionally as well. You don't have to choose between them.
Also in your book, you reference another book that you read called The Drama of the Gifted Child. You talk a little bit about some different parenting styles and some issues that some gifted students might run into with, the way that either if it's how they're pressured by outside forces or just the expectations they put on themselves. I love this part of the book here. You talk about reading the book felt like therapy to you. And it suddenly felt that you saw, as you had for many years, that you were missing your life, that I was missing my chance to be happy, missing my chance to be free. I was also missing something else. The joy that comes when you stop feeling threatened by other people's accomplishments and let yourself be open to the beauty that they bring into the world.
Yeah.
I think I love the way that that's put. Can you talk a little bit about
Sure.
some of those issues that gifted students might run into and that kind of freeing feeling that you felt when you learned to just not compete with everybody, but
Sure.
appreciate what's around you?
I'm glad you asked about that. Most people who interview me about the book don't. That's The Drama of the Gifted Child. It's a famous book. It's a classic book by, I think she was Swiss or German psychotherapist named Alice Miller. It has nothing to do with our American educational system. I think it's from the 70s or 80s. As I said, she's European. But by gifted, I heard the name of that book for a long time, and I thought gifted meant like violin prodigies. She really just means what we would call high achieving students. And as a psychotherapist, a psychoanalyst, she's talking about the family dynamics. The drama of the gifted child is the family dynamics of the high achieving child. I should also say it's a very short book, and the real heart of it is about 20 pages. So you could read it the important part in an hour, and I didn't read it until I was writing Excellent Sheep. I wish I had read it 20, 30 years earlier, because it just lays out in very clearly and forcefully that toxic psychological dynamic between the typical parent of a high achieving student and the kid, which is this pressure to succeed in order to satisfy parental ego, parental narcissism. I said the admissions process was different when I was a kid 40 years ago, but there are a lot of families already like that. And my family was one of them. And there are always a lot of families and more families around. They're often upper middle class, but not only. A lot of immigrant families are like this. Any kind of family can be like this. A family that pressures the student. Basically, what it says is love is conditional. I don't want you to be yourself. I don't want you to do your best, although maybe parents will pretend that. I want you to gratify my ego by achieving success. And so I can bask in your and take credit for your reflected glory. And that success in America today and for decades now has meant in the first instance admissions to a selective college or university, ideally an Ivy League level university. And it sets up a horrible dynamic also within the student, because you vacillate, you swing back and forth between megalomania. You know, you get the A and you think you are the greatest person in the world and mommy and daddy love you and they tell you that you're the best. And then the next week you get an A minus, or God forbid a B plus, and your entire ego structure collapses because it's dependent on this constant stream of praise, of self-esteem. I hate that term, self-esteem that's really not self at all. It's really esteem that's constantly pumped in from the parents. And then the thing that you read, which I'm so glad you read, it sets up this horrible feeling of competition, because it is actually a competition. Only one kid can be the best in their high school, right? And graduate first in their high school. Only one kid for many high schools can get into Harvard, or one kid can get into Yale. So your self-worth is also depends on, you're constantly measured, you are constantly comparing yourself to other people. And so you can't acknowledge the value of what they contribute, because to do that diminishes you.
I love how you put in the book too that kind of how parents can sometimes project on their students, that when their student gets into a highly selective school, the parent feels like they just got an A+ in parenting.
Absolutely. I think so much of parenting is like that now.
So by reading the book and kind of coming to terms with that, it sounds like that had a big impact on you and kind of was a kind of weight off your shoulders. What advice would you have to some of our gifted students in relation to what they can do to kind of achieve that kind of revelation, that kind of peace in their lives?
It's very hard. I mean, I should say that although I didn't read that book until I was much older, I had the same thoughts for many years. I mean, I swung back and forth, and I knew that what I was doing was wrong, and I felt many times that I'd freed myself from it. I think reading such a powerful account helped me, but I can't say that even to this day that I'm completely free of it. I think I'm much freer than I used to be, and I think that it doesn't govern my choices, which is probably the most important thing. But these patterns get so deeply ingrained in us that I think we have to always fight them. I compare it in the book to, I'm not in Alcoholics Anonymous myself. I have some friends who are, but the whole idea of that program is that you have to go every day. You have, it's not a problem that you solve. It's just a problem that you manage. And I think high achieving students are addicted in some probably even literal way to praise, the way an alcoholic is addicted to drinking. So my advice is, become aware of this, become aware that it doesn't have to govern your life. Fight it, try to fight it internally as best you can. Become aware when you're having those thoughts. And then also at some point, at some level, if you have parents like this, you need to do battle with those parents. This may not seem very comfortable. I think one of the problems of contemporary parenting, especially in these social strata that we're talking about, is that is this kind of insidious alignment of interests between parents and kids. Like, your parents are your friends. You know, my parents were old world immigrants. You know, I have a lot to blame them for, perhaps unfairly, but one thing I can't blame them for is that they never tried to act like they were my friend. So the lines were very clearly drawn. And I think this is and I think psychologists would tell you this is the normal, healthy process of growing up. You have to separate from your parents. You have to be estranged from your parents, not permanently estranged, not hatefully estranged, but you have to put distance between yourself and your parents. And that can be a battle. I mean, I think that always is a battle, and it's usually a protracted battle. And it doesn't have to happen with acrimony, but it has to happen. And it's not going to happen from the parents. It has to happen from the young person. They have to, in whatever way and at whatever time, say, listen, this is who I am. This is who I want to be. This is what I want to do. And you're just going to have to live with it. And the secret that parents don't want you to know, and maybe don't know themselves, is that it's the kid who has all the power in that situation. And the parents almost always do learn to live with it because they need you more than you need them. Doesn't feel that way now, but it's true.
Well, I got to tell you, I really enjoyed reading your book, Excellent Sheep. So I highly recommend it to anyone watching this video. You've given us a lot to think about, and I really appreciate you taking the time to come on the call with me. So I appreciate that very much. Thank you.
You're welcome. Thanks for doing this.